As we discussed in the last video, colonial rule, initiated by the Scramble for Africa or the Berlin Conference, lasted for less than a century. But the effect of colonialism would shape future African political and economic realities. The new states of Africa would be based not on African interests and needs, but European expediency. In Africa, the two dominant powers in terms of the colonial rule were Britain and France. Britain used a method called the indirect rule in its managing the colonies, and that was through the use of district managers or district officers and working with local leaders, chieftains, other tribal leaders to, in effect, tax and control the people in its territories. French assimilation was a rule whereby the French government sought to make promises of French citizenship and belonging to French culture and bringing people in that way making them a part of what would be called Greater France. Pictured in this slide is Cecil Rhodes, who envisioned a united Africa under British rule. He is the one for whom the Rhodes Scholarship is named after. He was often called the first millionaire in Africa, his fortune being primarily through diamonds in southern Africa, the De Beers Diamond Company being a part of his legacy. With regard to colonial trade, the African colonies, from them were extracted inexpensive commodities that were shipped to Europe. Things like palm oil, rubber, cotton, and different minerals and metals. And in turn, the European countries would take those raw goods and would manufacture textiles, household goods, farm implements, and ship them back to Africa at high cost. Samir Amin proposed what he called the colonial extraction systems to explain how the various countries that colonized Africa treated the places that it controlled. The first is the Africa of colonial trade economy, which was about cash crops. Prior to colonization, subsistence farming was something that was very popular and very common in Africa, where people grew crops for their own benefit to feed their families, also to trade at markets locally. But with the institution of colonization came cash crops, where things were grown to be sold on the international market and exported out of the country. And in places like Senegal, Ivory Coast, the Gold Coast, which is now Ghana and Nigeria, things like palm oil, rubber, cocoa, cotton, peanuts were grown. The Africa labor resources was primarily about people, about labor migrants who were sent to work in mines and in white settler plantations in Kenya. Countries like the Belgian Congo, Northern Rhodesia, and South Africa was where this primarily took place. And the reason why is because the material resources were few and far between, in contrast to the Africa of colonial trade economy, where the land in which to grow the cash crops was plentiful. The material resources was not there in these areas. And that's why labor became the primary thing that was produced in those areas. The Africa of concession owning companies, and much like the previous discussion, the previous slide, areas where the environmental conditions didn't allow for much cash cropping. Then again, labor was the primary commodity. And here, the actual areas were transferred over to companies, concession owning companies, and places like the Gabon, the Congo, Central African Republic, the Belgian Congo. And we already have learned about King Leopold, and the brutality that took place in the Belgian Congo under his leadership and at his urging. And that was something that we saw in this. And then finally, white settler Africa. And in Kenya and Tanzania and southern and northern Rhodesia, these were places where traditional African farming was pushed out. The ability to even grow cash crops was shut off, and the people in those areas basically became subservient to white settlers in those places and did their bidding and worked on their behalf. As early as 1920 in West Africa, we see some reform movements happening as Africa begins to move toward independence. In part, this was later became fueled by the participation of Africans in World War II on behalf of several countries in Africa that were involved in this battle. The first colonial independent nation in 1957 was Ghana, and most of the independence that happened on African soil ultimately was the result of armed struggle. It was difficult in East Africa. In North Africa, the Algerians fought for 8 years. The Kenyan Mau Mau were involved in some violent struggles. We've talked about them before in class, and Jomo Kenyatta's alleged involvement. He's always denied that he was directly involved with the Mau Mau, but we do know that the resistance in Kenya was a very strong and concerted one, and ultimately resulted in Kenyan independence. Even as countries did gain their independence, after the initial excitement and enthusiasm that was there as the colonizing countries pulled out, some realities struck home. Part of them was the fact that the colonizers had instituted authoritarian structures, which were far removed from African traditions and the needs of the people, and in many ways were very foreign to the ways in which they were used to operating. Colonialism had been about controlling the population, exploiting resources, maintaining European systems, and the use of force through police and colonial troops to keep the rule in check. And these things were something that were foreign to those Africans that came into power once the colonizing nations left. Donald Gordon discusses some of the post-colonial circumstances that the new African leaders and people faced as they came into independence. That first would be the growing social class inequalities that have been caused by the actions of colonial administrators, where often they work to pit various groups against one another, particularly in areas where indirect rule was the order of the day. The heightened tribalism and competition, where previously there was not a strong identification with ethnic and language in other groups. People primarily were were more concerned about their own particular clan or local groups. And so the whole idea of a national identity and all of that was very foreign again to those Africans who now found themselves in power and found themselves independent. Another aspect that happened was a shift in population from the rural areas to those primary administrative cities. So those centers that started to grow that were the source of in times during colonialism, where administrative bureaucracies located their offices and built structures and other things, and many people began moving out of the rural areas to those areas because that's where the power tended to be concentrated after colonialism and moving into independence. Also, there have been limited educational opportunities during the time of colonialism. The education that was given in many places and many areas didn't prepare the people for governance, didn't prepare them for working in private businesses or development agencies and all of that. So there was a void there. This ends part one of the discussion of toward independence.